He was the kind of man whose name carried weight in rooms where decisions changed the course of nations. Karl Reinhardt, 38 years old, Wehrmacht intelligence officer, cryptographer, architect of evacuation routes that existed only on paper and whispered commands. In the spring of 1945, as Germany crumbled under Allied fire, Reinhardt walked into the Bavarian Alps and never walked out again. The war was ending, cities burning, armies scattering like frightened animals. But Reinhardt was different. He didn't run, he disappeared. Witnesses said they saw him near Mittenwald on May 1st, moving fast along a narrow goat trail, burdened by a heavy rucksack and metal case strapped to his side. One man claimed he greeted him with a curt nod, eyes sunken but determined, the kind of look worn by someone who knew exactly where he was headed. But that was the last real sighting. The next morning the trail was empty. No boot prints, no tracks, nothing but the echo of distant artillery rolling through the valleys like thunder. Allied forces swept the region within days. They searched abandoned barns, bombed out chalets, tactical bunkers blasted open like broken ribs. They found uniforms, weapons, documents left behind by terrified soldiers, but no trace of Reinhardt. His command post had been stripped bare, his quarters emptied, his identification documents missing, his body never recovered. Some believed he died in the mountains, swallowed by the snowmelt, or buried beneath a landslide that erased all evidence of his final moments. Others insisted he fled to Austria, boarded a smuggler's caravan, slipped through the chaos into Italy, then vanished into the shadows of South America, like so many others. But one detail refused to fade. Reinhardt knew things. Not rumors, not gossip structures of encrypted communication networks, locations of experimental research stations, evacuation protocols built to survive invasion. He was too valuable to simply vanish. And yet, he did. For 78 years, his disappearance sat in dusty archives, labeled unresolved. A ghost case, a footnote in the collapse of a nation. But that would change, because buried somewhere in those mountains was the truth. And in 2023, hikers would finally stumble upon the evidence that Karl Reinhardt had never left the Alps at all. In the final days before Karl Reinhardt vanished, Allied signal units intercepted a transmission so fragmented and distorted that at first it was dismissed as static. But buried beneath the crackling noise, the message repeated itself monotone, hurried, stripped of emotion. A male voice, unmistakably German, repeating a code phrase no one could decode at the time. Sanctuary secured. Contingency plan active. The date was April 29th, 1945, just 2 days before Reinhardt was last seen. The transmission originated somewhere deep within the Bavarian Alps, bouncing off high ridgelines before reaching Allied listening stations, making triangulation nearly impossible. The voice was flat, weary, almost mechanical. But one detail chilled analysts. The speaker signed off with a call sign known to belong to Reinhardt personally. And then, silence. Not static. Not interference. Silence. The frequency remained open for hours. Nothing else came through. The Allies logged it, translated it, filed it away in their swelling folders of intelligence debris left behind by a dying regime. Investigators later reviewed the transcript. Sanctuary in the mountains. One line read, distorted but identifiable. Initiate fallback. Contingency plan remains viable. To most intelligence officers, it sounded like delusion. The last gasps of a desperate man clinging to lost command authority while everything around him fell apart. They chalked it up to panic-induced fantasy, a hollow threat, a meaningless broadcast swallowed by the chaos of war. For decades, historians treated it as nothing more than one more ghost transmission among hundreds. But there was something strange about it, something that refused to fit neatly into the chaos. The coordinates logged by 2 separate Allied listening posts indicated no known bunker, no supply depot, no fortress. Nothing that should have existed. And yet the signal was strong, clean, transmitted from a powerful radio set with a clear line of sight to the valley below. Whoever sent that message knew what he was doing. He was prepared, he was calm. And he believed he had a plan worth activating. What no one realized then, what no one would understand until the cabin was found, nearly 8 decades later, was that the message wasn't delusion. It was a warning, and Karl Reinhardt had been telling the truth all along. In the chaotic months after the German surrender, Allied intelligence teams combed through mountains of documents, interrogation transcripts, and deserted hideouts, looking for high-ranking officers who had slipped through the cracks. Names were crossed off lists with satisfying efficiency as fugitives were captured, identified, or confirmed dead. But then there was Karl Reinhardt, an anomaly wrapped in silence. His file was thick, swollen with conflicting testimonies, stamped repeatedly with the same red word, unconfirmed. Reinhardt had vanished cleanly, without the panic or sloppiness that marked the escapes of so many others. Interrogated officers mentioned him in passing, always with vague phrasing. He went into the mountains. He had a fallback location. He would never surrender. But when pressed, each witness faltered, their stories collapsing into contradictions. Some claimed he'd joined Werewolf, the last-ditch resistance movement that never became more than a whisper in the shadows. Others insisted he defected to Austria, switching identities with an injured soldier and slipping across the border dressed as a farmer. Another rumor suggested he'd been killed by his own men after refusing to abandon secret documents. There was no consistency, no body, no witness, no diary entries, no letters, just smoke. Allied command grew frustrated. MI6 and OSS analysts exchanged notes that read more like ghost stories than actionable intelligence. Search teams were dispatched into remote valleys, exploring abandoned mountain huts and frozen caves. Nothing. Dogs picked up no scent trails. No fresh graves revealed themselves. Even Luftwaffe reconnaissance photos from 1944, 1945 showed no unusual structures where Reinhardt was believed to be operating. His name surfaced in dozens of post-war interrogations, each time with less substance. "He knew too much," one captured officer said before clamming up completely. Another, trembling from exhaustion and fear, whispered that Reinhardt had spoken of a sanctuary that no one else was permitted to know about. Allied officers chalked it up to the delusions of a collapsing regime. They dismissed the tales as fiction. Reinhardt became a footnote, an inconvenient mystery overshadowed by larger manhunts for notorious war criminals. Yet his name never truly faded. It lingered in classified reports, incomplete dossiers, and the margins of intelligence files always circled, always unresolved. A man with access to the deepest secrets of the Reich simply evaporated into the mountains, and that terrified the people hunting him. Before he became a ghost in Allied archives, Karl Reinhardt was something else entirely, a prodigy hidden behind a soldier's uniform. Long before the war, he was an architect and engineer with a fascination for structures built into unforgiving terrain, bunkers carved into mountainsides, tunnels masked by natural rock, reinforced hideouts disguised as shepherd shelters. It was this obsession that caught the attention of German military intelligence. They didn't want him for his marksmanship or battlefield prowess. They wanted his mind. Reinhardt's career shifted overnight. He was absorbed into the intelligence apparatus, a world of black dossiers and sealed envelopes. He designed encrypted communication stations buried high in the Alps, installations camouflaged so precisely they blended seamlessly into the landscape. He drafted plans for radio towers disguised as watchtowers, tunnels carved beneath glacial ice, supply depots hidden behind false rock walls. And with every secret facility he helped build, his clearance level rose. Soon he had access to experimental weapons research, encryption algorithms ahead of their time, and classified escape networks designed to relocate officers if Germany fell. He visited research stations where engineers tinkered with early radar systems and primitive long-range jammers. He reviewed reports on magnetic propulsion prototypes and cipher machines intended to replace Enigma. He saw everything, and the regime trusted him. Too much. By 1945, Reinhardt had become one of a handful of officers who knew the locations of classified mountain installations scattered across Bavaria and Austria facilities that even other intelligence officers didn't know existed. Some were evacuation bunkers. Others were storage chambers for documents the Reich wanted to protect at any cost. And a few, the most secret of all, were designed as last resort sanctuaries for individuals deemed too valuable to lose. Reinhardt's access was so complete, so unrestricted, that after the war ended, Allied investigators privately referred to him as the architect of shadows. But there was one thing: no one knew what he did with that knowledge when the Reich collapsed. Because when Reinhardt vanished, he didn't just disappear with a rucksack. He disappeared with secrets that could shift the political landscape of a post-war world. And if he took those secrets into the mountains with him, the truth might still be buried there, waiting to be uncovered. While Allied intelligence tore apart mountains searching for traces of Karl Reinhardt, his family waited in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Munich, clinging to hope that refused to die. Martha Reinhardt had last seen her husband in late April 1945, when he kissed her forehead, touched the hair of their sleeping children, and whispered, "I will return, no matter what happens." But the war swallowed his promise, leaving her with two children: Anneliese, 6 years old, and little Tommy, barely 3, asking questions she couldn't answer. The weeks turned into months. Letters stopped arriving. Neighbors whispered pity behind closed doors. And still, Marta waited. She checked every returning soldier who limped down the street, scanned every train platform, hoping for a familiar profile. But none of them were Karl. Then, in late 1946, a postcard appeared in the mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Just a short message in Charles's precise handwriting: "I am safe." Nothing more. Her hands trembled as she read it. She pressed it to her face, as if the ink still carried his warmth. But the card offered no clues, no location, no explanation for why he couldn't come home. Months later, another message arrived: "Do not search." The words felt like a cold wind through her chest. She didn't tell the children. She couldn't. The third and final card came in 1948, a single sentence that haunted her until the day she died: "This is the only way." Investigators later examined the postcards. Handwriting experts argued, debated, compared samples. Some claimed they were genuine, perfect matches to wartime documents signed by Reinhardt. Others pointed to inconsistencies in the pen pressure, slanted strokes that suggested someone had traced or studied his writing. To this day, there is no consensus. But Marta believed. She never remarried. She kept Karl's uniform pressed and folded, kept his books on the shelf, kept a candle by the window every night. She raised 2 children on stories of a father who might return at any moment. And those children grew up carrying questions that carved into their lives the way glaciers carve mountains. Was he alive? Did he choose exile? Or had someone sent those postcards to keep the truth buried forever? By the mid-1970s, the name Karl Reinhardt had faded into obscurity, buried inside forgotten archives and whispered memories. But in remote alpine villages, something strange began to stir tales, traded over beer-stained tables, passed from shepherds to mountaineers, from climbers to hunters, rumors, oddities, things that didn't belong in nature. It started with a group of hikers near the Zugspitze who claimed they saw smoke rising from an isolated valley where no marked trails existed. Not campfire smoke, thin, steady columns that drifted upward like signals. When a ranger investigated the area days later, he found nothing but cold rock and silence. In the early 1980s, 2 ski tourers stumbled across a pattern of stones arranged in a geometric shape carved into the snow, a perfect circle of rocks enclosing a smaller triangle. The formation was far too deliberate, too precise to be the work of animals or weather. But by the time authorities arrived, the circle had been dismantled by an avalanche. Then came the story from a mountaineer named Klaus Brenner. He had been climbing alone in late winter when he saw footprints, deep, crisp impressions in fresh snow, but the tracks didn't lead anywhere. They simply stopped at the edge of a cliff. as though the person had walked straight into the air. Klaus reported the strange tracks, but the local police dismissed his story as fatigue-induced hallucination. He never climbed alone again, and it didn't end there. Seasoned hikers swore they heard the faint hum of machinery behind granite walls. Some claimed they spotted reflections, glints of metal hidden behind rock outcrops. Others spoke of doors carved into mountain faces that vanished upon closer inspection. Superstition took root. Locals whispered of an old hermit, a ghostly figure glimpsed at twilight, wearing a long coat and carrying a lantern. No one approached him, no one followed. They feared what they might find. And under all these rumors, beneath the folklore and fear, one name resurfaced: Karl Reinhardt, the officer who had known every hidden pocket of the Alps, the man who spoke of a sanctuary. The phantom that hunters swore still walked the ridgelines long after he should have turned to dust. By the late 1992, most historians had long abandoned the Reinhardt case, dismissing it as an unsolvable wartime disappearance swallowed by chaos and time. But one man refused to let it rest. Hans Volker, a thin, sharp-eyed investigative journalist with the stubborn persistence of a bloodhound, had spent decades digging through the shadows of old war stories. He was obsessed with anomalies, with names that didn't fit neatly into official narratives, and none fascinated him more than Karl Reinhardt. Hans found his first mention buried in a battered file at the Bundesarchiv, one paragraph, typed hastily on a fading sheet, noting, "Unresolved disappearance, possible mountain escape route." That was all he needed. From that moment, Reinhardt became more than a ghost. He became a challenge. Volker spent years traveling across southern Germany, knocking on doors of retired officers, scouring village archives, interviewing old shepherds who still remembered stories their grandfathers had whispered by firelight. Every rumor, every inconsistency, every unexplained detail seemed to circle the same truth. Reinhardt had vanished with purpose, not panic, not fear, purpose. Hans compiled everything: radio intercept logs, interrogation transcripts, patrol reports, missing person records. Patterns emerged, coordinates repeated. References to sanctuary resurfaced in 3 separate testimonies from 3 different regions. He pored over topographical maps until his eyes ached, searching for locations that matched the cryptic descriptions in Reinhardt's final transmissions. And again, one idea formed. Reinhardt had built something: a refuge, a hideout, a survival cabin tucked deep into the mountains where no one would think to look. Volker published articles suggesting the officer had engineered a self-sustaining shelter in the Alps, inviting ridicule from academics who dismissed him as a conspiracy theorist chasing myths. But Hans didn't care. He followed alpine trails, combed forgotten valleys, and interviewed hikers who swore they'd seen unnatural structures, smooth lines where nature should have been rough, rectangular shadows behind boulder fields, metallic reflections that disappeared when approached. His office wall became a collage of red strings, maps, newspaper clippings, and faded black and white photos. Friends joked he was losing his mind. But Hans knew in his bones that if Reinhardt had survived the war, he had done so in a place he designed with his own hands. A cabin hidden so well it would take decades before anyone stumbled upon it, and Hans Volker was determined to be the one who found it. It wasn't Hans who found the cabin first. It wasn't even a researcher or a historian. It happened by pure chance in the summer of 2023, when 2 experienced climbers, Lucas Weber and Pia Grunwald, decided to explore an unmarked ridge in the Wetterstein Mountains, far from established routes and guidebook recommendations. The ridge was steep, jagged, and brutal, the kind of terrain only seasoned mountaineers dared to tamper with. The weather had shifted unexpectedly, forcing them to seek temporary shelter behind a massive rockfall. That's when Lucas noticed a sliver of darkness at the base of a boulder wall. Not a cave, not a natural void. A narrow crevice, unnaturally straight, barely wide enough for a human shoulder. Curiosity pulled him closer. He brushed away a layer of debris, broken stone, tangled roots, snow hardened into ice. And beneath it, the wood appeared, old, weathered, perfectly cut. A concealed door wedged between rock and shadow. Pia's breath caught in her throat. She pressed a gloved hand against the surface. It didn't crumble. It didn't rot. It remained solid, preserved by the cold and protected by the stones around it. Lucas found a rusted metal latch buried beneath moss. When he touched it, the whole world seemed to pause. This was not a shepherd's hut. This was not a climber's emergency shelter. This was something else, something intentional, carefully hidden, designed never to be found. They didn't open it. They didn't dare. Fear and awe mingled in their eyes as they backed away from the doorway, snapping photos, marking coordinates, and sending everything to authorities with trembling hands. Within 24 hours, the area was secured by Bavarian mountain police. Within a week, historical investigators descended upon the ridge. And when news reached him, Hans Volker sat in his cluttered office staring at the email containing the first grainy image, the weathered door, framed by stone, and whispered a single word: found. The mountains had kept their secret for 78 years, but now the door was open, and everything was about to change. When authorities finally unlatched the concealed door and forced it open, cold air rushed out like a breath exhaled after 78 silent years, stale and untouched by sunlight. The beam from the first officer's headlamp cut into the darkness, illuminating a scene so perfectly preserved it felt like stepping into another era. The cabin was small, barely 3 meters wide, carved directly into the mountain itself. The air smelled faintly of metal, damp stone, and something older dust suspended in time. Along the right wall sat wooden shelves sagging under the weight of preserved food cans, their labels faded but still readable. Beans, pork, biscuits, ration tins stamped with Reich markings lay stacked in precise rows, undisturbed by insects or decay. A metal-eating tin rested on a crude table, as though someone had just stepped away from a half-finished meal and forgot to return. On the opposite wall, maps were pinned in meticulous order, yellowed, brittle edges curling. Balkan regions, Alpine passes, radio networks. Their corners were marked with Reinhardt's signature handwriting, razor-thin strokes tracing escape routes, hidden trails, and supply depots. Beneath them, wrapped like sacred relics in layers of cloth, lay weapons, a Mauser pistol, a compact carbine, and boxes of ammunition stacked neatly beside them. No rust, no corrosion, just silent readiness. But the greatest shock waited on a low wooden desk, notebooks, dozens of them, bound with string. Their covers were stained, edges worn, but the pages filled with dense ciphered writing symbols, numbers, patterns that formed no language known to investigators. Some pages contained diagrams, structures carved into mountainsides, ventilation systems disguised as natural cracks, escape tunnels no one had ever documented. Beside the notebooks sat an object that made even the most hardened officers pause: a handmade radio device, assembled from scavenged parts. It looked crude, yet functional, a transmitter built from scavenged metal, coils, and vacuum tubes. Wires ran along the walls, disappearing into crevices. The device still hummed faintly, as if some residual charge lingered after decades of silence. Nothing indicated struggle or collapse. No overturned furniture, no signs of panic, just a life interrupted. Everything was placed with precision, frozen in time. It looked as though Karl Reinhardt had stood up from that chair one evening, stepped outside into the cold mountain air, and never returned. The cabin didn't just hold artifacts, it held intention. And it felt like the walls themselves were waiting to tell a story no one had been ready to hear. It was tucked beneath a wool blanket on the narrow cot, its leather cover cracked and darkened by years of cold. When investigators opened it, the room fell silent. The first entry was dated May 2nd, 1945, the day after Reinhardt was last seen by witnesses on the trail. His handwriting was meticulous at first, the strokes sharp, confident, as if he believed he still had control over his fate. "I have abandoned the unit," he wrote. "There is no command left to obey, no victory to pursue, only survival." He described slipping through the collapsing front lines, watching soldiers scatter like frightened birds, hearing American artillery echo behind him as he climbed deeper into the mountains. He raided abandoned supply depots, gathering tools, food, spare parts. He hauled everything up narrow ridges, dragging metal components for the radio device he would later construct inside the cabin. "The sanctuary is real," he noted. "I must reach it before daylight betrays me." His tone remained rational through the first weeks as he documented the building of the cabin, boring into rock, reinforcing walls with timber, disguising the entrance beneath boulders. The journal became a blueprint of his exile. But halfway through, something shifted. The handwriting changed, letters slanted downward, lines uneven. His thoughts grew tangled. "They are searching for me," he wrote in June. "I hear them at night, voices below the ridge." There were no Allied patrols documented in that region at that time. Yet Reinhardt insisted, "Footsteps on the scree, whispers in the dark, I must remain invisible." Later entries described strange observations, lights flickering behind stone outcrops, the sensation of being watched even in the dead of night. He began placing stones in patterns around the cabin, marking routes only he understood. "The signals are not safe," he scribbled beside a sketch of his radio. "I transmit only when clouds cover the moon." In August, the paranoia escalated. Someone is near. They know. He wrote of hearing breathing outside the door, of shadows slipping between trees, of figures watching from ridgelines. But no tracks were found when he investigated. The final entry was dated October 14th, 1945. No signature, no farewell. Just 3 chilling words pressed so hard into the paper the pen nearly tore it. "They found me." Then the page ended, and the rest of the journal was blank. As investigators continued unraveling the contents of the journal, the early entries documenting Reinhardt's methodical construction of the cabin gave way to something far darker, a descent into a mind collapsing beneath the weight of fear, isolation, and guilt. The handwriting changed first. What began as crisp military precision gradually devolved into frantic strokes that bled into each other, sentences falling apart, words repeating like echoes trapped inside a hollow skull. Reinhardt's paranoia wasn't sudden, it crept in slowly, revealed through small remarks that grew more alarming as days turned into weeks. "The Allies will execute me if they find me," he wrote. "There is no trial for men who know what I know." He feared retribution not only from Allied forces, but from extremist factions inside his own fractured military machine, those who believed he carried secrets too dangerous to be allowed to live. "If they capture me, they will take what I built," another page warned. The paranoia deepened. Reinhardt described hearing voices carried on the wind, whispers threading through cracks in the canyon walls. "I heard them call my name," he wrote during one night in July. "Not human, not the wind, something else. They are looking for me." He drew sketches in the margins, silhouettes standing among the trees, elongated shadows cast on snow. "They wait until darkness," one note read. "Their steps follow mine." But when he investigated at dawn, he found nothing. No tracks, no sounds, only silence. He wrote about dreams, bleeding into waking hours, visions of figures, watching from ridgelines, of knocks against the cabin door when no one was there. Some entries suggested the psychological trauma of war had finally broken through the disciplined exterior of the soldier. Others hinted at something more primal, the terror of a hunted man. In late September, Reinhardt wrote, "I hear breathing outside. They stand close enough that I can feel the air shift." He barricaded the door with stones, reinforced the walls, and slept with the Mauser pistol beside him. Nights became indistinguishable from nightmares. And then, the final entry penned with shaking hands, pressed so violently into the page the ink tore through layers of paper, "They have found me." After that, the journal fell silent. No explanations, no closure, just the stark, unbroken terror of a man who knew his sanctuary was no longer safe. The discovery of the shallow stone grave came 2 weeks after the cabin was opened, when forensic teams combed the surrounding terrain, guided by maps and notes from Reinhardt's journal. A cluster of boulders near a narrow outcrop, caught the eye of a mountain officer's stones arranged too deliberately to be natural. When they brushed away the debris, they found bones sun-bleached, brittle, laid with surprising care beneath layers of shale. For a moment, the investigators wondered if they had stumbled upon an older burial, perhaps a centuries-old shepherd or mountaineer lost to the elements. But fragments of decayed fabric still clung to the remains' military wool, the remnants of a tunic, buttons stamped with the insignia of a 1942nd German uniform. DNA analysis confirmed what everyone had suspected. The bones belonged to Karl Reinhardt. Yet everything else about the remains raised more questions than answers. There were no signs of gunshot wounds, no shattered bones, no blunt force trauma, no evidence of a struggle. The teeth showed wear, but no breakage. Forensic experts ruled out violent death almost immediately. Instead, they pointed to starvation, exposure, or illness as likely causes. But even those conclusions felt incomplete. The grave was shallow, dug by hand, its edges rough, uneven. Someone had taken time to stack stones over the body, protecting it from scavengers. That meant one of two possibilities. Reinhardt had felt death approaching and prepared a place to rest, or someone else had buried him. But who? No fresh human remains or secondary footprints had been preserved, no tools or artifacts suggesting another presence. The earth around the grave was untouched by time, offering no clues. His remains appeared isolated, hauntingly solitary. Forensic teams noted something else. His uniform had been arranged neatly, folded beneath him, indicating a purposeful act. Perhaps Reinhardt had set his affairs in order, succumbing to the mountain's lethal cold after months of isolation and deteriorating mental health. Or perhaps he believed he was being hunted to the very end, leaving his final entry as a warning that would never be explained. The cause of death remained indeterminate. The mystery of his final hours remained unbroken. But one thing was certain: Karl Reinhardt never left those mountains. And whatever he feared in his last days, whether real, imagined, or something in between, he faced it alone. It was a forensic technician who first noticed the irregularity in the cabin floor, a faint hollow echo when his boot struck a particular plank, a sound too distinct to ignore. He knelt, brushed aside decades of dust, and pried up the wooden board. What lay beneath sent a ripple of tension through the entire investigation. Embedded into the stone foundation were 3 metal containers, each sealed with rusted clasps and stamped with identification numbers that hadn't been used since the final months of the war. The boxes were awkwardly heavy, the metal cold despite the stagnant air of the cabin. When they were lifted out and opened under controlled conditions, the contents inside stunned investigators. The first box held blueprints, large, brittle sheets, marked with Reinhardt's meticulous handwriting. They depicted structures carved into mountainsides, some already known, others not recorded in any historical records. These weren't standard bunkers. They were self-sustaining installations, built to withstand siege and secrecy. The second box held coded documents, pages filled with ciphers so complex that even modern analysts struggled to decode them. Strings of numbers, letter blocks arranged in spirals, sequences of symbols resembling mathematical formulas. Some pages bore the stamp of high-level military departments that no longer existed. And then there was the third box. Inside it lay notes bound tightly with leather straps, Reinhardt's experimental research files. Diagrams of radio towers disguised as alpine structures, sketches of propulsion prototypes, calculations involving magnetic fields, references to clandestine research divisions known only to a handful of officers. But among the pages, one phrase appeared again and again, circled, underlined, scribbled in margins. Operation Nebelhorn. Investigators froze at the sight of it. Nebelhorn. A rumored wartime evacuation plan whispered about in dark corners of intelligence circles, a plan designed to relocate senior officers, cryptographers, and scientists to remote mountain sanctuaries in the event of total collapse. Officially, the operation had never existed. Unofficially, Reinhardt's blueprints now suggested otherwise. The documents hinted at multiple locations, not just one. installations carved into cliff faces, hidden beneath glaciers, accessible only by coded routes. Some pages reference supplies shipments that continued even after the war was believed lost. If Nebelhorn was real, Reinhardt had not been the only officer assigned to such a sanctuary. The cabin wasn't just a hideout, it was part of something larger, something that had been deliberately erased from history, and the files beneath those floorboards were about to awaken old ghosts governments had hoped would stay buried forever. The moment photographs of the hidden files reached the Bavarian authorities, the tone of the investigation shifted. What had begun as a historical curiosity transformed into a tightly controlled operation overseen by federal agencies. Within 48 hours, representatives from the German Federal Archives arrived by helicopter, escorted by uniformed officers whose badges bore no units familiar to local police. International observers followed historians, intelligence analysts, and forensic experts from agencies that had no official reason to be there. They set up temporary command posts near the discovery site, their communication encrypted, their movements precise and coordinated. The press descended on the mountain like vultures, demanding answers. But the official statements were deliberately vague. Ongoing analysis. Preliminary findings. No reason for public concern. No photographs released. No documents acknowledged. No mention of Operation Nebelhorn. Hans Volker, the journalist who had devoted half his life to Reinhardt's disappearance, watched the press conferences with a grim, knowing expression. He recognized government evasiveness when he saw it. For decades, he'd chased fragments of stories dismissed as exaggeration: underground bunkers, secret evacuation protocols, missing officers who supposedly held too much knowledge to be allowed capture. And now, finally, someone had found proof. Volker wasn't on the mountain, but he had sources, people who disliked being muzzled. And within days, he received a folder containing grainy photographs, blueprints, coded pages, diagrams of structures never before documented. He published them. In hours, the images spread across news outlets and social media, maps marked with coordinates, sketches of unknown installations, pages stamped Geheim. His accompanying article posed one chilling question: what secrets did Karl Reinhardt die protecting? Government spokespeople scrambled to discredit him, calling the files incomplete and misinterpreted. But their evasions only fueled speculation. Why were certain agencies sealing documents before historians could review them? Why were foreign intelligence services suddenly so interested in a dead officer's cabin? And why were some pages, specifically those referencing Operation Nebelhorn, absent from official statements but present in Volker's leaked photos? Behind closed doors, meetings grew heated. Archivists whispered that Reinhardt's documents referenced not just sanctuaries, but personnel lists, names, officers, scientists, people who had vanished just as cleanly as he had. And if those names resurfaced, the historical narrative of the post-war era might fracture in ways governments were not prepared to face. Publicly, they insisted everything was routine. Privately, they classified more documents. And somewhere in the chaos, Hans Volker realized the truth. The cabin was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one that powerful institutions had spent decades trying to bury. With Reinhardt's remains recovered, his journals deciphered as far as humanly possible, and the hidden files sealed away behind layers of government discretion, investigators expected closure. But the cabin offered none. Instead, it raised questions that gnawed at the edges of logic, leaving behind a void that no official statement could fill. What exactly had Reinhardt been hiding from? His notes mentioned Allied forces hunting him, yet no records placed patrols near his sanctuary. He feared retribution from extremist factions, yet those units were dissolving in chaos, scattered, fleeing, dying. And then there were the more unsettling entries, the ones referencing voices in the wind, shadows moving at night, figures standing motionless beyond the ridge. Were those the hallucinations of a man unraveling under isolation? Or had Reinhardt encountered something or someone outside the realm of official reports? The journal never clarified. It only grew more frantic, more desperate. "They are close," he wrote. "They know. But who were they?" The whispers he described were never matched by tracks in the snow or physical evidence. Forensic teams found no secondary footprints near the cabin, no signs of visitors, no tools left behind by any other hand. He might have been alone, or the mountain might have erased others as efficiently as it erased him. Another unanswerable question hovered over the grave. Did he die alone? The careful arrangement of his body suggested intention, someone folding his uniform beneath him, stacking stones with measured precision. But the possibility that Reinhardt had buried himself felt impossible. Yet if someone else had performed the burial, that person vanished without a trace. No DNA, no artifacts, no explanation. Then there were the documents, Operation Nebelhorn, the coded sequences, the blueprints of hidden sanctuaries carved deep into the Alps. If Reinhardt wasn't the only officer assigned to such a location, where were the others? Why were their names absent? Why were some pages torn out, replaced with blank sheets? Volker's leaked photos hinted at personnel lists, names, redacted so thoroughly they were swallowed into black ink, and the government's reactions, swift, secretive, defensive, suggested the files contained truths not meant for public eyes. Behind the classified seals lay answers that might rewrite entire chapters of post-war history: evacuation plans, missing officers, experimental technology, and the possibility that Reinhardt's disappearance had been part of something far larger than a single man fleeing into the mountains. The cabin is now sealed, the documents locked away, the mountain trails wiped clean by snow and time. And yet, even after 78 years, the truth about Karl Reinhardt's final days remains just out of reach, hidden in the shadows of the Wetterstein Peaks and buried in classified files the world may never be allowed to see. This story was brutal, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.